In 1651, the Isles of Scilly became a focal point during the English Civil War, a conflict between royalist forces loyal to King Charles I and the parliamentarians. As the royalists faced defeat on the mainland, they retreated to Scilly, a remote archipelago off the southwestern coast of England. From this isolated stronghold, they launched naval attacks against ships from the Dutch Republic. The Dutch, who were allies of the parliamentarians, relied heavily on maritime trade and saw these attacks as a threat to their economic interests. Admiral Martin Tromp, a prominent Dutch naval commander, led a fleet to address the situation. With royalist privateers harassing Dutch shipping, Tromp reportedly issued a formal declaration of war against the Isles of Scilly in 1651. This declaration, though dramatic, was primarily symbolic. The Dutch had no real interest in waging a significant campaign against such a small and strategically unimportant territory. Shortly after, the parliamentarians subdued the royalists on Scilly, rendering the Dutch declaration moot. However, no formal peace treaty was signed, leaving the war technically unresolved for centuries. Following the declaration of war in 1651, the so-called conflict between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly entered a peculiar and prolonged dormant phase, lasting over 3 centuries. This war was unusual from the outset, as it was never marked by any active hostilities. The declaration itself arose from a relatively minor episode in the broader context of the English Civil War, where royalist privateers operating from Scilly attacked Dutch merchant shipping. Once the parliamentarians defeated the royalists and regained control of the islands, the justification for Dutch military action disappeared almost immediately. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear, no formal peace treaty was ever concluded. For the next 300 years, this forgotten war lingered as a legal and historical oddity. The Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly had no disputes, no further conflicts, and no awareness of their unresolved status. The lack of hostilities, combined with the relatively minor importance of the Isles of Scilly to international politics, ensured that the issue slipped entirely out of public consciousness. It was not discussed in diplomatic circles, nor was it ever a matter of concern in either country's historical narratives. The Isles of Scilly, a remote and sparsely populated archipelago, continued its quiet existence, mostly concerned with local governance, fishing, and small-scale agriculture. In the Netherlands, the matter was equally obscure. The Dutch Republic transitioned into the Kingdom of the Netherlands, navigating centuries of profound changes in European politics, from the Napoleonic Wars to the 2 World Wars. Throughout this period, the supposed state of war with the Isles of Scilly went unnoticed, overshadowed by more pressing geopolitical challenges and alliances. It is likely that even legal and historical experts in both nations were unaware of the unresolved conflict. The dormant nature of the war began to change only in the 20th century, thanks to the curiosity of amateur historians. In the 1980s, a historian named Roy Duncan, a resident of the Isles of Scilly, stumbled upon records that suggested a formal declaration of war had indeed been made by the Dutch in 1651, but never officially rescinded. This discovery sparked interest as a historical curiosity rather than a serious diplomatic issue. The story of the longest war in history captured public imagination due to its absurdity and symbolic value. The discovery prompted Duncan to reach out to Dutch officials to clarify the matter. In a gesture of goodwill and lighthearted acknowledgement of history, the Dutch government agreed to formally end the conflict. In 1986, a Dutch ambassador traveled to the Isles of Scilly to sign a symbolic peace treaty, officially concluding what had been, in effect, a centuries-long state of peace masquerading as war. The event was celebrated in a spirit of camaraderie and humor, marking the resolution of what had become a historical footnote. This dormant period is a testament to the quirks of history and the endurance of bureaucratic oversight. It illustrates how a forgotten declaration, born out of a moment of minor conflict, can evolve into a symbolic anecdote spanning centuries. The war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly is less a story of military or political significance, and more a reflection of how history can preserve even the most improbable narratives. Today, it serves as a lighthearted reminder of the complexities and unintended consequences of historical events. The rediscovery of the so-called longest war in history between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly occurred in the 20th century, driven by the curiosity of local historians. For over 3 centuries, the supposed state of war had been completely forgotten, as it involved no actual hostilities or political consequences. However, in the 1980s, Roy Duncan, a local historian and counselor on the Isles of Scilly, began delving into archival records. He stumbled upon references to a declaration of war made by the Dutch in 1651, which had never been formally rescinded. This revelation ignited interest in the peculiar story of a war that had persisted in name only for over 300 years. Duncan's discovery was more than a historical footnote. It was an example of how historical documentation can uncover forgotten or overlooked narratives. While the war itself had no real impact on Dutch or Scillonian history, the idea of its continued existence captured the imagination of both historians and the public. Duncan reached out to the Dutch embassy in London to inquire about the matter. His goal was to confirm the accuracy of the records and determine whether there was still a technical state of war between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. The embassy took his inquiry seriously, and officials delved into their own archives, ultimately agreeing that there was no evidence of a formal peace treaty ever being signed. The story quickly gained traction as a humorous and intriguing anecdote about the quirks of international relations. The concept of a war that had persisted for centuries without a single shot being fired amused many and highlighted the absurdities that can arise from legal and historical oversight. For the Dutch, the matter was an opportunity to demonstrate goodwill and humor in resolving an anachronistic situation. For the people of Scilly, it was a chance to draw attention to their small, remote archipelago, which rarely figured in global history. In 1986, the Dutch ambassador to the United Kingdom, Rijn Huidekoper, visited the Isles of Scilly to formally end the war. A symbolic peace treaty was signed on April 17, 1986, in a ceremony held on the islands. The event was conducted with good humor and a sense of camaraderie, reflecting the lighthearted nature of the conflict's resolution. The signing was attended by local dignitaries, residents, and media, turning it into a celebration of historical curiosity rather than a serious diplomatic affair. The treaty's signing marked the official end of a conflict that had existed only on paper, but it also became a moment of connection between the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly. The event underscored how history, even in its quirkiest and most insignificant corners, has the power to bring people together. It demonstrated the enduring human interest in stories that challenge conventional narratives of war and peace. The rediscovery and resolution of this war have since been featured in numerous books, articles, and documentaries as an example of historical oddity. It has become a symbolic case study in the unintended consequences of bureaucratic processes and the long-lasting impact of even the smallest historical actions. Today, the story of the longest war serves as a reminder that history is filled with unexpected surprises, and that even the most obscure events can have a lasting legacy, if only in the realm of humor and storytelling.